Welcome to the 13th tutorial of phase 2, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about the animation. So we already know what animation is, right? So animation is the process in which we transform an object from one state to another with the help of frames per second, right? And that's what we're going to learn in this tutorial. So let's get down to it. So as you can see, I have this cube in my 3D viewport, and we are going to use this 3D viewport to create our animation. But before creating an animation, let's just talk about this timeline which helps us to create that animation. So you can see we have these numbers written on our timeline, right? These numbers are actually the frames. We have 10 frames, 20 frames, 40 frames, and so on. So whenever we're going to create an animation, we're gonna set keyframes in this timeline which gonna help us to create the animation, and we're gonna see the transformation of this object from one state to another. So you can play the animation on this timeline by simply pressing spacebar on your keyboard like that, and you can see we have that FPS written on our window, right? So that FPS means the frames per second, and you can change the speed of that frames per second by simply going to output properties and go to frame rate. Then you can simply change the value of your FPS. More higher FPS will give you more speed to play your animation, and similarly lower value will play your animation slowly. So we had 24 FPS in our frame rate, which means 24 frames on this timeline is going to be our 1 second. So let's just quickly create an animation with this cube and learn about this timeline a little bit more. So to create an animation, we need to add the transformation properties of this object on this frame number. You can also select the frame with the help of this playhead. So to add the properties, you need to press I on your keyboard when you are in 3D viewport, and then you will see this insert keyframe menu, which actually allow us to add different types of transformational properties to our object in the timeline. So you can see we have location, rotation, scaling, which is actually same as this move, rotate, and scale tool, which are actually our transformation properties of this cube. So we are going to pin down location as well as scale for our cube on this position on frame 1. So let's just quickly select that one, and now you can see we have that diamond shaped point in our timeline, which is actually the keyframe. This keyframe is actually holding the property related to location as well as scale of this cube, because I'm going to create an animation for location as well as for scale. So let's just quickly select another frame on which we can add another transformation property related to this cube. So I'm going to move this cube 4 meters away on the y-axis, and to do so you can simply press G, Y, and then press 4 on your numpad, and then press enter. And now you can see our cube moved 4 meters away in the y-axis. But I also want to scale down my cube by half the size. So to do that, simply press S, 0.5, and then press enter. So now we have these new transformation properties about this cube on frame 20, but you can see it didn't create any keyframe, right? So again, if you want to add the keyframe, you need to press I on your keyboard and go to any one of these properties, which is, so our is lock scale, so I'm gonna select that. Now you can see we have created another keyframe successfully in our timeline. So now if you slide in between these keyframes, you can see we have created a small animation in which our cube transforms its location as well as size from one keyframe to another. So suppose now if you want to change something on already built keyframe, all you need to do is simply select your object, change one of its transformation property. Suppose I want to increase the distance, just simply press G, Y, and let's just add 4 more units like that. And then you can simply press I and choose any one of these properties, which is our lock scale. And now that new property is assigned to that previously created keyframe. So just always remember that you can simply replace your previously created keyframe information with new information just like that. So that's how you can create keyframes in your timeline, and by pressing I and then adding those properties as keyframe into your timeline. But there is another way which can help you to create these keyframes more quickly, and that is this auto keying. If you activate this auto keying and now change the frame number to 40, and now if you move this cube 8 units on the x-axis and scale it up to level 2, you will see that this auto keying will create another keyframe on this frame. So let's just quickly do it. So move the cube on x-axis just like that, press 8, press enter, also scale up to 2 units like that, and now you can see it automatically created that keyframe, right? But remember one thing, when you're gonna use the auto keying is going to use the log.scale property by default. So it's completely up to you that which method you want to use. You want to add properties by yourself or with the help of this auto keying. So I'm going to create few more keyframes with the help of this auto keying so that we can learn about these keyframes a little bit more as well as this timeline. So I'm going to hover to frame 60 and then I'm going to move this cube to y-axis 8 units like that, and then scale it down to half again. Similarly, go to the 80th frame and then move this object on x-axis 8 units backwards like that, and then scale it up to level 2. So now you can see we have successfully created small animation with this cube, right? The position and scale of our cube changes throughout these keyframes. So let's just talk about these keyframes a little bit more. So you can simply select all the keyframes and then you can move them around by simply pressing G on your keyboard, just like that. You can also move them around by simply select them and drag them around with your left mouse button, just like that. You can also scale them down by simply pressing S on your keyboard, and now you can see you can simply scale it down. But you can also see that we are scaling them down from that playhead of this timeline. So it is obvious that it is going to calculate the position of your playhead. So if you're gonna scale down from here, so now if you scale it up, you will see the scale is going on both sides because it is taking this cursor or playhead as its pivot point. So always be mindful of its position when you're gonna use the transformation tool on the timeline. However, when it comes to using the rotation, timeline doesn't work with the rotation. But when you're gonna press R, you will see we have this set keyframe type, which is the different types of keyframes which you can add in your timeline. These are just different colors of these keyframes. So suppose if I want to select these keyframes and want to set them in another color, so I can simply use the breakdown or simply use the extreme or literally anything. These different types of keyframes are nothing but just helps you to create colorful keyframes. Suppose you have created multiple stages throughout your entire animation and you want to break down those stages with different keyframe colors, and then you can simply use this different keyframe type to assign color to your keyframes. So let's just quickly check few other functionalities of this timeline. So first of all, we have these buttons which are just similar to any video player or music player. We have a forward playing button, we have backward playing button, right? Similarly, we have the buttons to select the keyframes, the forward keyframes, the previous keyframes. Similarly, we have buttons to go to the end point of this timeline and start point of the animation. So speaking about start point and end point, you can see we have this white section as well as this dark tone section in our timeline, right? So why we have two different sections in timeline? But the white section means when you're going to start the rendering for your animation, then Blender system is only going to render out all the keyframes which are inside this white section. So if you have created any keyframes on the dark side of this timeline, Blender is not going to render out those keyframes. And you can increase or decrease the size of this white space by simply changing the frame number from here, which is the start frame number, which is this one, and the end number, which is the 250, right? So you can simply change this value according to your own need. So I'm going to crank down this value to 80, and suppose if I create another keyframe on frame 100 in which I will move this cube 8 units on y-axis in the negative direction. So let's just quickly do it. Move the cube on the y-axis 8 units on the negative side, just like that. And now let's create another keyframe, log.scale. So now you can see we have this keyframe on this dark side, right? So let's just quickly play the animation and see how this white section and dark section works. So if I play the animation, you can see my cursor only moves from start to the end. It doesn't go to the 100 frames of the timeline, right? Which means the Blender system is actually allowing me to play as well as the render out the only white section keyframes, not the dark ones. But you can slide your cursor throughout white section as well as the dark section without any problem. But when it comes to playing the animation, your cursor is only going to work in between from the first frame as well as the end frame, which you can clearly see, right? So what if we want to preview this dark side keyframe? And to do so, we have another option in this timeline, which is this clock. This is the preview range button, which actually gonna help us to preview other keyframes in this timeline. So if you activate it, you're gonna see we have the orange layer covered on our dark side, right? Which means you can set your animation preview range in your 3D viewport with the help of this preview range button. So you can simply reveal the dark side by simply changing the frame number from this hand button. You can see it is moving that orange color of that preview range. And now if I play the animation, you can see my cursor will go down to the dark side of the animation, right? Pretty nice, right? So Blender helped me to preview those keyframes which are on the dark side with the help of this preview range. But remember that whenever you're gonna render out your animation, Blender is going to render out all the keyframes which are inside this white section, not on the dark side. So this preview range is only available to extend your preview range to see the animation in 3D viewport. So we also have this caddy which actually shows the frame number on which your cursor at. Similarly, we also have few properties on this side of this timeline. We have the playback. So you can see we have different number of functionalities in this panel, right? So first of all, we have the no sync and the frame dropping and AV sync. So if you play the animation in your 3D viewport, you can see we have that FPS written on our text on the 3D viewport, right? This FPS is the frames per second speed of this animation. And you can see sometimes it colors in red, which means due to some reason the animation is lagging behind from the actual frame number. And this can happen due to a lot of reasons. And the major reason is the geometry of your 3D model can be a little bit dense, which actually making the lag of the speed. So you can improve this speed by simply go to the playback, and then you can simply changing the sync mode to frame dropping, and it will drop some frames, and which will help us to achieve the smooth animation in between the keyframes. Similarly, we have the AV sync, which is going to help us to set up the sync between audio video by dropping some frames. Similarly, we also have a few other properties. The first one is the audio scrubbing, which means if you are using any audio in your animation, and when you slide through your keyframes, you're going to hear some audio sound which is scrubbing through your entire animation. So you can simply turn it off and turn it on from this audio scrubbing property by simply activating or deactivating from here. Similarly, you can mute the audio from the animation. Then we have the subframes. You can see we have this frame slider over here, right? So you can simply activate the subframes, which gonna add 100 subframes to your that specific frames. So now if you try to slide this number, you can see this number gonna crank up to 100 until it reaches to the next frame, which is the 51, right? So that's how you can add subframes to your frames. And the next one, we have the limit playhead to frame range, which means your playhead is going to be slide only inside this white section from frame 1 to frame n, not on the dark side. Similarly, we have the follow playhead, which means suppose if you are playing your animation and this white section is somewhere over here, right? So if you play the animation, you can see your playhead is going and disappearing from this part because it is moving further on other frames, right? So once you activate this follow playhead, and now if you play the animation, then you're gonna see the Blender is going to follow your playhead even after it gets disappear after this frame. So let's just play the animation, and now you can see Blender automatically updates your timeline with other side frames, which are these, right? So that's how you can use the follow playhead to follow your playhead on the timeline. Then we have the play animation in, which means you can activate your animation updates in these different types of editors. For example, let's just suppose if I play the animation on my timeline, you can see in object properties, you can see these transformation properties of your animation, right? So suppose if I hover my mouse on these properties, you can see the numbers are rolling down on all these properties, right? So what if I want these properties to keep rolling down their numbers? Doesn't matter if I keep my mouse over onto these properties or not. So if you want to see those numbers to keep rolling down, you can simply go to playback and simply activate these property editors. And now if you play the animation, you're gonna see those numbers are now rolling down in these properties, just like gas station meter, right? So similarly, you can also use this property into different editors like image editor, sequences editor. Suppose you have created a mask in image editor for your animation for compositing purpose. You can simply activate your animation update into your image editor, right? So that's how you can use different types of editor to simply activate the animation information update. After that we have keying, which is going to help us to create the active keying set, which is actually tutorial for another time. After that we have new keyframe type, which is the same which we have seen. Then we have this auto keyframing with add and replace, which means when you're going to create keyframe on previously created keyframe, then what it should do, it should replace the previously recorded data, or it should add and replace the previously recorded data. By default it is set to add and replace, and that's what I'm gonna use. So after that we have layer recording, which is actually related to NLA editor, which is actually one of these animational editors. So in this tutorial we're actually going to discuss these three editors because these are actually perfect for beginners. These two are actually a little bit advanced as a beginner, so we are not going to discuss in this tutorial. So cycle aware, which is also related to the graph editor, which we're going to discuss in this tutorial ahead. After that we have view properties, which is same as few other editors which we have seen in previous tutorials. We have area to split down, right? View frame, if you want to see and view frame, suppose your cursor is in a frame, you can simply press numpad 0 button to specifically see that frame. You can also press numpad period sign to see your timeline, to see your animational keyframes. Similarly, if you have a mess of keyframes in your timeline, you can simply press home button on your keyboard to see all the keyframes. Then we have only keyframes selected channels, which we're going to discuss in dopesheet. So which is also another editor type which is used for animation. Then we have the marker lines. So we didn't talk about markers yet, right? Well, you can also create markers in your timeline by simply pressing M on your keyboard, and then you can see it has created a marker in your timeline. And you can see we have F27, which is the frame 27 name assigned to that marker. You can also change the name of your marker by simply going to marker and rename marker, or you can simply press Ctrl M, and now you can simply change the name. Suppose if I want to change name my explosion, and then press OK, and now you can see that marker is renamed to my explosion. You can use it for many reasons. Suppose if you want to add any specific thing in your animation and you want to set markers for those stages, for those different effects, so it can be pretty useful. You can simply delete by simply selecting them and press X or delete key and then delete them. Similarly, we also have the blind camera to markers, which means if I create multiple cameras in my animation scene like that, change this duplicate this camera and duplicate this camera on this angle, and suppose I set this camera angle something on this location by simply pressing Ctrl Alt numpad 0 and this camera onto this angle, and then you can simply press Ctrl Alt numeric pad 0, and now we have set this camera to this angle. Similarly, this camera on this angle, first you need to select the camera by Ctrl numpad 0, and then you can simply press Ctrl Alt numpad 0 to assign that camera on that angle. So now we have set 3 different camera angles to our this cube, right? Which is actually creating 3 different cameras in our animation, right? So now you can bind these camera to your markers, but first you need to create some markers. Suppose I create a marker over here on the 30th frame and similarly on the 40th. So now if I move down to this first marker and select this camera, go to markers, bind camera to markers, and now you can see the camera name is assigned to this marker. Similarly, we're going to do with this marker, go to the marker and select the camera and then change to bind camera to markers. Go to another frame, select this one and then select this one and go to markers, bind camera. And now you can see we have bind these 3 cameras to our markers, right? So now if you pay attention on camera, you will see that every camera has an arrowhead on itself, right? But this arrowhead of this camera is completely filled with dark color, which means this camera is actually the active camera of the scene. So if you press numpad 0 button, you can see, right? What if we want to change the camera angle throughout our entire animation? So now if I play the animation, you can see this black arrowhead moves from this camera to this and this camera to this, which means we are changing the camera angles throughout our entire animation with the help of that marker binds. So this can be useful when you're gonna use different camera angles throughout your entire animation scene. So let's just simply delete them, and you can simply delete these markers. So after these markers, we have one thing to discuss about this timeline, which is this object properties color. You can see these properties are actually green in color, which means this cursor or the playhead of this timeline is actually rolling in between the keyframes. You can see. So as I slide this cursor to the keyframe, you can see the location and scale of this object properties is changes to yellow color because we assign location scale onto this property, right? So as I move down to this keyframe, which we created with the help of this auto keying, you can see this rotation is also changed to the yellow color, which means this property is also assigned to keyframe, right? But when it comes to the first keyframe, you can see there is a green color on the rotation, which means this property is not assigned to that keyframe. So you can simply change this property again by simply using this lock scale. So now you can see the color of that property is also changed onto this keyframe because now we have assigned that property onto this keyframe as well as on this frame. So after this timeline, we also have few other editors which we use to create animation in our Blender system. So one of these is the dopesheet, which you can select from editor type, go to animation and dopesheet. And now you can see we have this another editor which can help us to organize our keyframes throughout the entire animation, right? So the dopesheet is actually the advanced version of timeline which is going to help us to work around these keyframes more better. So the first thing about dopesheet is its keyframes look. You can see that in timeline our keyframes were in diamond shape, right? But in dopesheet they are actually looking circular, right? We also have the left side on this dopesheet which actually giving us the summary about the entire scene. So we have the cube which we have animated, and we have action of this cube which is the animation, and further we have the object transforms. And if you open up this caddy, you will see we have a lot different number of things going on in this left side, right? So it can be a little bit daunting for the first time, but you don't need to worry about these things. These are actually the different number of channels. As you know that we transform our object in 3D viewport with the help of move, rotation and scale, right? Which is also known as location, rotation, scale, right? So location, rotation, scale is actually available as channels on this left side, but in 3 axes, right? So just like that, the transformation properties are actually available on this left side, but with all different axes as they are on separate channel. You can see we have the location on x-axis, location on y and z, similarly scale on 3 axes, and similarly rotation on all 3 different axes. So you can access all these channels separately and then tweak around their settings by yourself. Suppose I want to change the setting on this x-axis like that, you can simply select and move the keyframes on the dope sheet like that, right? So that's how this dope sheet works. We also have a wrench button, marker and lock. So lock button is actually to lock down your channel, so if you don't want to commit any more editing on that specific channel. And this check or uncheck box is available to activate any specific channel to effect in your entire animation or not. So similarly we have this wrench which is actually similar to this modifiers wrench button, right? So this is also available for modifier, which we're gonna learn about in graph editor, which is coming ahead in this tutorial. So let's talk about this dope sheet a little bit more and see how it is advanced from the timeline. When you can see the first thing is the keyframes, which is looking a little bit different from timeline, right? So you can change the shape of these keyframes by simply go to key and simply go to the handle type, and then you can see we have different shapes of these keyframes. You can simply change it to vector, and you can simply access these properties by simply pressing right mouse button, and now you can see we have the handle type over here. So you can simply change it to align, you can simply change it to free or anything else. So every single time the look of these keyframes gonna change with different type of handle type. So you will understand these handle type more better in graph editor because these are related to the graph editor. Similarly the interpolation, which you're also gonna understand more better in graph editor. However, you can still apply these properties from this dope sheet by simply using any one from here. Similarly, you can change the interpolation modes. By default it is set to the Bezier, but you can change to constant, linear, which we're going to discuss in graph editor. So similarly you can also change the keyframe types, right? If you change it to extreme, now you can see the color of these keyframes change to the red color, right? So which we have already seen in timeline. By default it is set to the keyframe, and now you can see we also have these yellow bars inside our this dope sheet, which is actually telling us that there is no change is going on in between these keyframes on that specific channel. Which means suppose I hover my mouse in between these keyframes, you can see the location and scale of this cube is changing on y-axis, right? So if I check the y location, you can see there is no yellow bar in between these keyframes, right? Which means there is some change going on in the animation in between these keyframes on the Y location. But when it comes to these two keyframes, there is no change has been made on the Y location, which you can clearly see because Q is moving on the x-axis, right? So let's just talk about a few other functionality of this dope sheet. So first of all, we have this bar, which is going to help us to select and deselect the object from our 3D viewport. By default, it is activated on this selection type, which means you are only going to see the keyframes of those objects which you have selected from your 3D viewport. But once you deactivate it and create another object with keyframes, you're going to see the keyframes as well as that object in this summary. So similarly, we also have this hidden button, which means you will also see the keyframes of all the hidden objects inside that collection. I repeat, inside that collection, which means it is only going to show you the keyframes of all the hidden objects which are inside only that specific collection, not outside the collection. So similarly, we also have these errors, which are going to help us to see the errors in our timeline. This is actually related to the another editor type of animation, which is the drivers. So this is also a tutorial for another time because these two are a little bit advanced for beginners. So we'll talk about in drivers tutorial. Then we have this filter type, which is going to help us to filter down some things in this editor. Then we have the auto snapping, which is going to help us to snap throughout this grid, and you can select different options from this caddy. Then we have the proportional editing, which means you can apply transformation tools to your keyframes by simply pressing G and S, but you can't rotate because if you press R, it's gonna give you that set keyframe type. So you can apply this proportion editing on your keyframes, right? You can see clearly, so which can be pretty helpful in sometimes. So after that, we also have properties on this side. First of all, the dope sheet, which you can see we have different types of modes under the dope sheet, which means you can use this editor as action editor, shape key editor, and also these. So action editor is actually used in NLA editor, so definitely I'm going to talk about it at the moment. Similarly, shape keys, which is also related to tutorial for another time, which is actually used to create shape keys for your models, for your 3D models. Then we have the grease pencil for 2D animation, masking for compositing, and then cache file. Cache file is actually related to Alembic. Alembic is the technique through which we can import and export our animation from one software to another. So these are all tutorial for another time. Then we have the view, which you can clearly see it is way more advanced than timeline. So we have the sidebar, which you can see, but there is no properties going on in the sidebar, right? So you can simply hide it. Most of these properties are very simple to understand, but few of them which are very important, I'm going to demonstrate you very quickly. So another one, we have the show sliders, which can help you to add sliders onto your channels, and you can manipulate these values with the help of these sliders without going on to graph editor or changing the speed or value from curves. More accurately, you can simply tweak down the setting from these sliders. And then we have the show group colors, which actually is related to the groups. So you can create groups of these channels. Suppose you simply select these 3 channels and press Ctrl G on your keyboard, and now you can see we can create another group for these channels. So now you can see we have rotation group under this section, and now you can see all 3 properties in this new group. You can simply ungroup them by simply pressing Ctrl Alt and G, and now those properties are ungrouped. So you can also delete these properties if you don't want to see them in your timeline by simply selecting them and press delete, and now you can see those properties are gone. So after that, we have show handles and interpolation, which is actually related to the graph editor. Show curve extremes, if you activate it, you can see we have some sort of black and yellow pattern going on inside the keyframes, right? This is actually telling us about the interpolation of our curves, which you can see in graph editor. But this option actually gives you the functionality to see your interpolation method, which actually gonna help us to see the curve extremes. And these are curve extremes you're gonna understand more better in graph editor. After that, we have the marker lines, which we have already seen. Auto merge the keyframes, if you want to merge your keyframes just like 2 vertices in edit mode. Show seconds, if you activate it, you will see your timeline in seconds. So after 24 frames, you're gonna see the next second in the timeline. So let's just deactivate it. Then we have the log time to other windows. I will show you when we're gonna work with graph editor too. Then we have the set preview range, which is same as this timeline. You can activate it from here, right? But you can also select the preview range by simply press on your keyboard, and then you can simply select the frames on which you want to activate your preview selection, like that. You can also deactivate it by simply pressing Alt P on your keyboard. Now it's gone. After that, we can set auto set preview, which you already know, and we have seen these properties already in timeline. You can also toggle between graph editor and dope sheet by simply pressing Ctrl Tab, and you can see this is the graph editor. Then we have the select, which can help you to select your keyframes differently. Speaking of keyframes, one more thing. Suppose when you select any keyframe like that, right, you can simply press K on your keyboard to select the entire keyframe selection of these channels on that specific frame. And this entire keyframe selection on that specific frame is actually the column of keyframes, which you can see here, right? Similarly, we have few other functionalities which you can check by yourself, and you can also see their shortcuts in front of them. So feel free to check them by yourself. Markers, which is same as the timeline, you can sync and lock the markers. And then we have the channels, which is actually giving us all the functionality related to these channels. You can group them, ungroup them, disable them, enable them, right? So you can check them one by one by yourself. Similarly, we have options for keys, that you can delete the keys, change the keys, insert the keys, right? So we are already familiar with this. So now we are familiar with this dope sheet, that how it works. So now the time to check out the graph editor, which you can simply activate by simply opening up another window. Go to editor type, go to graph editor. And now you can see we have these curves in the graph editor, right? So we can also access to other channels from here. So now you can see we have curves available for all the channel in this graph editor. And just like dope sheet, you can manipulate these settings, but with the help of curves. You can also hide and unhide your channels which you want to see in your graph editor and which you don't want to see. And to do so, you can simply select that specific channel, press H to hide that, or you can simply select that specific channel which you only want to see your timeline, and then press Shift H, and it's gonna hide other channels and now you will only be able to see that specific channel into your graph editor. Which you can clearly see we have the X location as curve in our graph editor, right? You can see we have these points on our graph editor, which is similar to the keyframes on our dope sheet as well as the timeline. So every single keyframe is actually created as a point on this graph editor. And you can see when I select any one of these points, you can see we have these pointers coming out from that point, right? These are actually the different handle types of our keyframe. If you remember from handle types, if you press right mouse button, you can see we had different handle types from here, right? So these are these different types of handle types. You can change this handle type from anything else. You can change it to vector, you can change it to free, you can change it to automatic, you can see, which is change to Bezier, change to automatic, you can see. And these handles work very differently from each other. And the automatic one works like that. The vector one works more better like that. It gives you complete freedom to work on both handles separately from each other, but they are actually connected to this point. You can simply select these points, move them around by pressing G on your keyboard, rotate them around by pressing R on your keyboard, and as well as scale them down by pressing S on your keyboard. So you can apply all three transformation tools on this graph editor, and it's gonna work just like a charmer. So simply you can apply all these different types of handles and try to change your animation according to your own way. So if you play this animation, you can see if I change the direction of this curve like that, you can see how quickly it impacts the animation, right? If I rotate this big curve like that, you can see how quickly it changes the way this cube moving around in the 3D viewport, right? Similarly, you can change handle type to like vector and now change the handle type to like that, and now you can see the cube is changing very weirdly in our 3D viewport. Isn't it great? It's awesome. So similarly, you can apply different handles as well as interpolation and using types, which is the new addition onto these properties to your curves. By the way, I forget to mention one thing, that this graph editor as well as dope sheet and timeline works in x-axis as well as the y-axis, which you can use for scale down these properties. Suppose if you want to line these 2 points together, you can simply press X on your keyboard and press 0, and now you can see these keyframes are scaled down to that specific point. So similarly for the y-axis, simply press S, Y, 0, and now you can see those two keyframes are now equal. So now you can simply change the interpolation type, which is actually set to Bezier by default. You can set it to linear. simply select it from here, change it to constant, and now you can see your keyframe changed to constant. And now if you see the animation, you can see the cube kind of pops out on that point rather than moving from this point to that point. So similarly, you can change different types of interpolation methods to circular. You can see how animation quickly changes. Similar, you can add bounce, and now you can see the curve is a little bit bouncy, and now you can see the bounce inside your animation, right? So similarly, you can also change the easing type, which actually gonna change the way your curve is interpolating between these two keyframes, and it's gonna change the ease out and ease in between those two keyframes. So you can change the ease in, and now you can see the position of this curve changed, right? So similarly, you can change it to ease out, which is this. Similarly, you can use the ease out to ease in and ease out, which is something like this. So you can experiment out by yourself with these all different options. So let's just talk about a few other functionality of this graph editor. So you can activate the normalize, which actually gonna set your graph editor from range +1 to -1. So if you activate the normalize, you can see your graph editor quickly shoved down to +1 to -1. If I select one of these keyframes and try to move it down on the y-axis, you can see it doesn't go below the -1, which can be pretty useful when you are editing different curves and there is a lot more larger scale to these values on this axis. So it can be pretty useful, and make sure you activate this refresh, otherwise you have to refresh this normalize after zoom in or zoom out by yourself. So if you activate this, it will automatically change the value according to the zoom in and zoom out value. Similarly, we also have these properties, which is exactly same as the dope sheet, but we also have new property down here, which is the pivot point. So suppose if you want to apply any transformation tool on these curves, you can use it with the help of this pivot point. You can change it to 2D cursor, individual centers, according to your own choice. So after that, we have these few other properties. Let's just quickly check them out. So you can see we have these properties, which is exactly same as the dope sheet, right? So you can add the sliders over here and even deactivate them. So feel free to experiment with these properties, which are very similar to the dope sheet. We have select, which is also same as the dope sheet. Marker, which is also same. Similarly, the channels. 90% of this functionality is just same as the dope sheet, which you can check out by yourself, so no need to worry. Similarly for the keyframes. So similarity between these functionalities and tabs makes it more easier to use in between the dope sheet as well as the timeline and graph editor, right? But there's one thing which is added to this graph editor, which is this blue line, which is actually the cursor of this graph editor, which you can activate or deactivate from here like that. So there is another thing which has added to the graph editor, which can help us to create more better results for our animation. So let me change it to Bezier and let me press N on my keyboard, and now you can see we have few properties down on this side, right? So if you select the X location, so now we have few more properties on this section, right? So from here we can change the color of this curve of this X location. You can change the color by selecting different color modes. So this is very easy to understand. There is only one major thing in this sidebar properties which we need to understand, which is these modifiers. You can apply different types of modifiers onto your curve just like you apply onto your mesh from these modifiers, right? So to access those modifiers, make sure you always select the channel from this left bar. So now you can see we have this modifier window on this properties bar, and to access all the different types of modifiers, you can access it from this panel. You can choose any single modifier you want to apply onto your curve. Suppose I want to add noise onto my curve, and you can simply select that, and now you can see it has added a noise pattern on my curve. And if I now play the animation, you can see there is some sort of noise going on my cube. It is kind of shaking, right? So you can tweak around these settings by yourself. You can crank up the scale, you can crank up the phase, strength. Now you can see it looks more shaky in the viewport, right? Similarly, you can change the depth, you can change the offset if you want to. Then we have these two more caddies, which are going to help us to control this noise more better on my curve. So the first one is the restrict frame range, which gonna help me to add this noise only on some specific range of frames. So suppose I want to add this noise only from frame 20 to frame 40, and to do so you can simply add start frame 20 and end frame 40. Now you can see the noise is only applied in between frame 20 to frame 40. And you can also ease in and ease out that noise by simply tweaking the setting. You can see the curve is kind of easing in from the start and easing out on the end, right? After that, we have the use influence. It can help you to control the influence of your modifier on your curve, just like that. However, remember that these properties only going to work until you're gonna keep these properties open up like that. Once you collapse them down, the properties turn off at the very moment. To simply activate, you can simply open this caddy up. So make sure you keep them activated until you want to apply that effect onto your curve or to your animation. So similarly, we also have few other modifiers like stepped interpolation, which is gonna help you to add like staircase stepping pattern onto your animation like that, which can be pretty useful. Similarly, it has its own properties which you can check by yourself. So similarly, we can also apply the built-in function, which is gonna help us to add the amplitude and phase multiplier, which you can see. And as you can see, your cube is kinda creating a phasing effect like a sci-fi. If you have seen the Flash series, you may have remembered that Flash and Reverse Flash used to create these mirage effects, right? So you can create these beautiful effects with the help of this built-in function. Similarly, we have the generator, which is gonna help us to set an equation with the help of y and x functions. So it can be pretty useful. You can change the value of x from here, and you can see the movement of a cube also changes in the animation. So that's how you can use these different types of modifiers, and it can be pretty useful for your workflow. So that's it for this graph editor, but there was one thing which I want to demonstrate you in between these editors is the log to other window keyframe, which you can clearly see. If I select this cube and play the animation, you can see the playhead is moving from frame 1 to frame 80, right? But when this animation is going on, I can still play around with this timeline. I can move around, I can change its position or scale, whatever, right? But what if you want to create a sync in between these editors, that you want to play them same on the graph editor as well as on the dope sheet? Well, you can use one property from the view. You can simply go to the log time to other windows and then simply activate on the dope sheet too. Now you can see the animation is moving same on both different editors. Even if I mess with this timeline, suppose if I try to move it around like that, or even try to move these keyframes like that, but now you can see they are synced to each other, and they are imitating the same movement from each other, and they are also imitate the properties from each other. If I move from the dope sheet, the graph editor also moves with that, and it can be pretty useful when you want to keep your workflow very organized, very clean when it comes to using these keyframes from graph editor as well as the dope sheet or even the timeline. So that's it for this tutorial, guys. I hope you guys learned something from this tutorial. So this was the basic introduction to these different editor types which you can use for your animation. One thing which I forget to mention is that, do you remember the dummy I created in previous tutorial, right? And I have created the animation with that dummy, so you can check that animation, which is pretty nice. Pretty nice animation, right? So I wanted to demonstrate you something which is related to these bonds. Is if you select these bonds and open up this caddy in this left bar in the dope sheet, you will see there is a long list of bonds is going on in the left bar, which are the same bonds in this armature. So even if you select any one of these bonds and open it up, and you can see every single bond contains all the transformation properties under their hood, right? So now you can see every single bond in this armature contains the transformation properties on 3 axes separately as channels, right? So make sure you use pretty much caution when you're going to work with these keyframes with bonds in this dope sheet as well as the graph editor. So it can be pretty helpful. So that's it for this tutorial, guys. I hope you guys learned something from this tutorial, and if you did, please leave a thumbs up and share with your friends and subscribe to the channel. So thanks for watching, guys, and see you guys in the next part.